Okay then, good evening everyone and welcome to the UXPA UK event for the 9th Global Accessibility Awareness Day. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Bailey and I'm the current president of the UK chapter. UXPA is an international organisation. Just a few little notes. If you would like captions, we do have a live captioner who is working hard for us this evening. So if you would like them available, please activate the closed captions button at the bottom of the Zoom window. There is also if you prefer to have them in a browser, in the email that was sent out to you earlier this afternoon, there is a link where you can view the captions on a tablet or a mobile device, and that gives you a little bit more flexibility in how you view the captions. But if you do use the captions in Zoom, if you click the chevron next to the closed captions icon, there are some options for you to increase the size to suit. It goes without saying I would rather be welcoming you under slightly different circumstances. This is our second remote event. We normally hold face-to-face events in the UK, mainly London, as that's where a lot of our committee are based. But last month we did our first remote event and it was really successful. And obviously we do want to keep going and keep engaging with the community. For those of you who don't know, UXPA UK has been going for about 18 years, supporting the UX industry across the UK. We are run entirely by volunteers, so we all put these events together in our evenings, lunch breaks, spare time, cheeky breaks from work whenever we can. Normally we would run face-to-face events. Obviously for the foreseeable future, we are moving to remote webinars, but we also offer a mentoring scheme. So if you are interested, it is worth having a look at that on our website. And just a date for the diary, our next event will be Thursday, the 18th of June. Our events are generally the third Thursday of every month. So, Global Accessibility Awareness Day. This is one of these great days where we get together as a community alongside World Disability Day. I checked the GAAD website today and there were 186 similar events listed there, which is fantastic, and I'm sure there are many more that weren't listed, and I'm sure that many of you have dropped in events already today. I had one this morning and unfortunately due to timing issues my presentation was cut out, so hopefully there'll be no technical hitches with this one. I did go back and do some research. GAAD's been going for obviously 9 years. I went back and had a look through the archives, and in 2012 there were 12 public events listed on the website, and by the time we got to last year that was up to 85, and obviously many more are unlisted. But what it shows is what we're doing is working, and that the message for accessibility is getting out there, and hopefully one day we probably won't need a Global Accessibility Awareness Day. It might well be a Global Accessibility Celebration Day, although that's maybe not such a good acronym. Everyone who's involved in accessibility has a story to tell. You know, many people do it for personal reasons, and there certainly have been involved in some very live debates, and we hope to have that this evening. We have two speakers. The first one I'll introduce very shortly, but just to give you an indication of how this will work. The chat feature is there for you to submit any queries if you're having any problems during the talk. But also what we'll do is the speakers will each speak for around 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So if you want to use the Q&A function for that, if you raise your hand, and then if you're happy to speak, what I will do is I will go in the settings and unmute you, and then we can do the questions that way. Or again, if you feel more comfortable, just in the chat function, and we'll keep an eye on that as we progress. So without further ado, in UX we hear a lot about dark patterns, which is where people do sneaky things to make you do stuff you don't realize you're doing. So buying something or paying something extra for something that you haven't really asked for, or signing up for something that you don't really want to. In accessibility, it's a little different, and Daffy's going to speak about that in a moment. He's going to talk about when people try to do something good, but the end result perhaps doesn't work as they intended. So I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Daffy. He is a principal consultant at AbilityNet. Daffy, over to you. You should be able to share your screen now.
Oh, fantastic. I will get started then. I will share my screen and I will share my desktop, which hopefully will allow me to do. There we go. And I will also share video. So in theory, people can also see me. Hello, everyone. So thanks a lot, Chris, for the introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about kind of accessibility anti-patterns. So things we do when mostly developing apps and websites that, for whatever reason, don't get necessarily the solutions in place that we perhaps thought they would. Now, a little bit about me. So my name is David, it is Welsh for David, and I'm professionally an accessibility consultant. Now, in practical terms, that means that I spend a lot of time complaining about websites and apps. I asked a colleague to explain my job to me in perhaps simple terms, because I can get a bit kind of technical with accessibility, and they said that my general shtick is your code is bad and you should feel bad. Now, I really refute that, but I occasionally in accessibility get into the mindset of, okay, in order to make this more accessible, we need to maybe kind of make this a bit more efficient or make this kind of a bit more elegant. Now, that being said, today is going to involve personal opinions. So there's going to be some topics today that are potentially not necessarily controversial, but are my opinions from my experience and not necessarily the opinions of my employer, UXPA, etc. In as much as I'm going to be talking about things that maybe kind of cause problems rather than introduce solutions. Now, in terms of the kind of clients that we work with, so it's people like AXA, Barclays, Birmingham City Council, BT, British Museum, Camelot, E.ON, the FA, HSBC, Lloyds, Microsoft, NHS, and so on. Now, the reason I'm listing out these clients isn't to say, hey, work with some pretty exciting people. It's more to identify that when I'm talking about my experiences in accessibility and the challenges I face, it isn't small agencies. It's not necessarily people trying accessibility for the first time. It's people that have been doing it for a long time and potentially still kind of fall into traps or potentially still find themselves learning as they're going along. That being said, the projects that I'm going to be alluding to today were of course not done by any of the clients on display on the screen. Their projects were perfect, absolutely amazing, and developed by wonderful and handsome people. For audio descriptions, I did a comic wink to imply that maybe some of the things I'm talking about today might have some overlap with some of these clients. Now, in terms of core themes, in terms of what I'm hoping to kind of talk about today, it's things like accessibility that gets removed, ironically, to make things more accessible. So we design something, we develop it, and we put what we think to be accessibility into it, and then for whatever reason, we need to pull that back out again. And it's working about why that happens and trying to avoid it happening in the first place. There's accessibility that paradoxically creates challenges. So things, for example, like to do with scalability or localization, where we implement accessibility in such a way that makes other things more challenging. But then lastly, accessibility that kind of paradoxically results in users feeling excluded. Now there's loads of ways to kind of talk about accessibility and think about what it means to people, but it's a pretty kind of core and agreed sense that, well, we're doing this to include people. We're doing it to make sure that everyone has opportunity, access, and empowerment to what we build. And if people are excluded from what we build, then that's kind of antithetical to accessibility. And yet there can be some times where the way in which we approach accessibility can be exclusionary. Now, first and foremost, there's an approach to accessibility that we can think of as being a kitchen sink approach. So where we just do everything in our power to add as much accessibility into it as possible, where that can kind of create an accessibility overhead. So the most common and admittedly relatively harmless kind of issue is things like descriptive alt attributes on decorative images. Now, one thing that I'll always stress is that it's a super good practice to have what you might consider to be content redundancy. So you have multiple ways to understand your content. You have a picture, and then you have some text underneath the picture, and they kind of communicate the same thing. And that's really helpful for users such as myself who have dyslexia, who potentially might be able to understand something better when it's communicated in multiple formats. That being said, if we do things like add alt attributes to those images that again we've established are there for redundancy to make sure that users are given the opportunity to understand it through multiple formats, well, in some cases that can add kind of extra overhead and it can make the user experience a bit lesser. So as an example, if I switch over to Chrome, here I'm on the TfL website, and as we saw in my PowerPoint, there's kind of multiple kind of cards with contactless, Oyster card, and each of them has an image above it. Now, if I inspect these objects, so I'm now just kind of looking in the DOM of the page, and I'm going to go over to accessibility in the Chrome developer tools to get a sense of what this object is. So this is going to be what this link, so these cards are all links. And what I'm looking at now, because I'm inspecting the object and looking at the accessibility properties of it, I'm going to get a sense of, okay, how would a screen reader treat this object? How would voice recognition treat this object? And the one thing that it would do is it would treat this object as having the name of red contactless bank card over yellow card reader, contactless, use contactless, card or device, pay as you go on all our transport services, link. Now the reason for that really quite verbose name, because if we look at it on the page, it doesn't have all that information. Just looking on the page, we can see contactless and about using the contactless, but there's some extra information here. And where that's being derived from is the fact that this image has this descriptive alt attribute. So this is a case where, you know what, it's fantastic that they've got multiple ways to understand the content, but they don't necessarily need to add things like alt attributes to all those images in as much as that information is already on the page. So from as a cited point of view, I can see both of those objects, but then from a screen reader point of view or a voice recognition point of view, it would actually be easier for them to have null alt attributes. So it's just alt equals and then an empty string to communicate to the assistive technology, hey, this is on the page, but you don't need to worry about it because I promise that I'm going to put some other content elsewhere on the page to make sure users know what I'm talking about. Now, that's relatively harmless in the grand scheme of things, and that's more so about polish and making sure that what you've got makes sense and doesn't kind of include unnecessary amounts of verbosity. A more problematic use case is ARIA cleanup. So this is something that we see very, very commonly when we're auditing websites, and it can be quite problematic. Now, if you haven't worked with ARIA before, you can kind of think of it as being a syntactical sugar that you can add when you're building your websites, where you can come along and you can say, well, I'm building something that's not quite in the HTML spec. I'm building a tab panel, an accordion, for example, something that I can't just pull off the shelf, and we need our developers to make from scratch or to make something that is kind of non-standard. And you can build some amazing stuff with ARIA that has incredible compatibility with assistive technology, and you can also make some very, very bad mistakes with it. Now, if I swipe back over to Chrome again and give some examples. So an example of using ARIA quite well would be something like a tab panel, for example. So here we have a tab panel. This is something that doesn't exist in the HTML spec, and it's one with 3 tab panels. If we visually look at it, we can go, well, they're kind of like buttons, but they're kind of a row of buttons, they're sets of buttons, and more to buttons, they're kind of tabs, and they have a kind of shared tab panel in the middle. And yep, if we inspect this, and again, we look at the accessibility properties of it, because then the accessibility properties is what assistive technology is going to be caring about, then they can see, okay, so this is, it has a name which relates to what we saw on the page. It is a tab. So even though it started life as a button, it's been expanded upon to be made into a tab. So a screen reader user would hear something like tab 1 of 1. We also see that it has a selected property, So where visually on the page it has this highlight, that's also something we can do with ARIA. We can make sure users are aware of this kind of context that we're adding with CSS, that we're adding with our JavaScript. We can build up these custom components to work really nicely. And this even extends to really quite complicated widgets like toolbars, for example, where we can really get to some kind of real complex web apps where we can leverage ARIA to support them and make them quite usable with assist technology. That being said, there are rules to using ARIA. Now, the first rule of it is things like, if you can avoid using ARIA, you should, as well as things like when you should build on native semantics and when you shouldn't. And the very important thing that the spec has is it very explicitly says that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. So when we can talk about things like, okay, so this unlocks the key for me to be able to build custom components, what we have to stop and think about is the spec tells us that doing it wrong is worse than not doing it at all. And to give an example of that, what we have here is a kind of common carousel library that people often use. And if we visually look at the page and we do the same thing with that tab panel, we can say, well, there's some kind of region here, maybe an image will go there. There are some kind of buttons. There's kind of a row of buttons underneath here. And you can kind of mentally cognizant how this might work. So kind of buttons, some kind of image in the middle maybe, and maybe when you're activating this, maybe we could use some ARIA to prompt assist technology to announce what the current item is. E.g., I'm on 4, I activate the button and it says, hey, you're now on 5. Now, if I look at some of these properties, some of the items we get out of this, so if I go over to accessibility, is that we see that this is actually a toolbar. So assist technology will come across this carousel and think that what is being used is this kind of toolbar widget that you might have seen in something like Google Docs. And if we start to drill down a bit further into it, we see that it's also a tab, which again, from an assist technology point of view, we're expecting something like this, a kind of set of tab panels with a shared panel. And then we have a tab panel that's also within a toolbar. So we're expecting a tab panel within a toolbar, and you can really quickly get the sense of, okay, if I was using with this with assist technology, it would probably be very confusing. And this idea that no ARIA is bad, sorry, is worse than no ARIA starts to make a bit of sense. So the big clue there is just to avoid using ARIA unless you really know what you're doing. Now, here's where we're going to enter into somewhat more kind of controversial territory. So ARIA is something that we can fix. It is something like people like myself at AbilityNet, we can consult on your use of ARIA and try to kind of point you in the right direction on how to use it more efficiently. The rarer kind of accessibility pitfalls we have that are more harmful is things like accessibility plugins and sidebars. Those things like accessibility user first and user away. Now, these all claim to protect your business from lawsuits. It's a very common theme with all of these kind of plugins that say that they will just make your things accessible out of the box, is that they will say that they'll protect you from lawsuits, with the idea being that there is a magic bullet for accessibility. Now, I am biased, so do take my view with a pinch of salt, although I will try to be measured and I will try to be fair. So they are snake oil. They are absolutely awful. They do not solve accessibility problems and they create accessibility problems. Now, for that reason, due to the fact that I do think they create accessibility rather than solve them, I can't fully endorse that you use them. Now, that's quite a bold statement, right? I'm saying that these things actively cause problems, and I'm going to have to prove that. So if I go back over and if I give us a brief demo of the BBC website, because we have the BBC here today, and they actually have a fantastic website. And what I want people to do at home is I want them to, if they can see the screen, is to guess where they think I am on the page. So if I start to tab through this page using the tab key, I move from news to sport. And if I do shift and tab, I move back onto news. If I tab forward again, I'm on sport. And if I tab forward, where do we think I'm going to go? If you guess more, you are right. And if I keep moving through the page, I can move on to search, I can type in search, results can appear, and I can start to access these. Now that is a very, very core principle of using kind of keyboard navigation, using tab and shift tab to move through the page, moving element by element, and then using return or space to activate them. Now, if we look at an example of a website that uses a plugin, so I'm now going to be looking at Userway. And this is an example of a website where if I start to tab through, you'll notice, again, the kind of same thing is happening. This seems to be working quite well. I can tab through the page, I can see where I am on the page, and for example here in this nest of links, I can see focus going on to each individual link. However, this is working not because of their plugin, but because the back end of the website has been coded in quite an efficient way. Now, what they can use, if you did use this plugin, is you would be giving users access to this sidebar. The idea being that you would not have to refactor your code, so you could use your existing code, and that this plugin would essentially solve the problems that might be in your code. And let's try and demonstrate that. So what we saw again was me tabbing through the page, going tab, 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 tab. So tell you what, let's see if we can access some of these features that come in this plugin. And the first thing you might notice is that I can't tab onto that button. So from my point of view, so here I'm using my keyboard, I'm using tab and shift tab to navigate through the page without having to use the mouse, which we saw working perfectly with the BBC website. And I'm falling at the first hurdle. I'm falling at the hurdle of trying to activate keyboard interaction mode. But okay, let's say I use the mouse. Let's just say this is a one-off glitch. I use the mouse to activate it. And what I instead am going to do, I'm going to now activate keyboard mode. So now what I'm being able to do is I've activated a mode that is going to make a website work with a keyboard that might not otherwise work with a keyboard. Because again, it's not refactoring your code and it is making it accessible by adding the plugin on top. And if I again start to tab through the page, again, okay, the focus is a bit better, it's a bit more obvious. I'm tabbing through the page and suddenly I can't tab onto these links individually. Suddenly focus is now moving onto these kind of groups of link as one. So as opposed from going link, 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 I'm going on to multiple links at once. So for example, right now, I do not know which of those links I'm on. The kind of red box there for focus appears to be on multiple links at once. So here is an example where I could not activate the assist technology functionality that is going to make your website more accessible. I could not access using assist technology. And when I activated it, the experience of using the website was worse from an accessibility point of view. So when I say that they do not solve problems and they create them, that is exactly what I'm talking about. And it is something that you will see across these providers. This is not a one-off thing. Now, if we kind of convinced, okay, so I don't want to go down the route of using a plugin, what are some other kind of pitfalls that I might fall into? So in terms of problematic accessibility, one way to make things more accessible is with kind of hidden and hard-coded strings. So what we have here is an example of a cookie settings button. So you activate it and it does something to do with cookie settings. Great. Now, in this case, it has just some text on the page, so it has cookie settings, and that's all you would need to do. You could just have a button with some text in it, and as far as that assist technology cares about, because when I was showing and I was inspecting the element, it would automatically go, okay, that's a button, and its name is cookie settings. However, what they've done in this case is they've given it an ARIA label. They have manually specified what you consider to be an accessibility name. Now this is redundant in this case because it already has a name, but this can be useful. So for example, something like an icon button, where there isn't any text on the page, there's just a visual icon, and you want to give it a kind of name. So ARIA label does have a purpose, but it involves setting a very specific value onto the page. Another example is using CSS. So you might have, for example, like a find out more link. And to make that a bit nicer from an accessibility point of view, you might think, well, find out more, that's a bit vague. And from a screen reader's point of view, screen reader user point of view, sorry, when they're accessing links, they will just hear that. So when I'm tabbing through the page, if I was a screen reader user, I would just hear, yes, I agree, link. And when I tab forward, no, take me to the settings link. So the kind of screen reader user interaction mode is very much element by element by element. And you can imagine that if you fell on something which just find out more, you might think, well, that's a bit vague. I want the user to know that they're going to find out more about something. And you could use some CSS and hidden text to achieve that, or an ARIA label. The problem is that when you add this behind the scenes accessibility, is that people struggle to maintain it. People forget it when they're localizing websites, for example. So you might have a web page in English and a web page in French, and unless you go through and make sure that you manually translate every single one of those ARIA labels, you will create a negative experience from an accessibility point of view. Because you can imagine the example I have on screen of this cookie settings button. If they updated the cookie settings text on the page to be in French, but forgot to update cookie settings, then as far as assistive technology cares about, that button would still be in English. Similarly, if you're adding hidden text, the designer isn't necessarily seeing it on the page. The people who are doing a localization aren't necessarily seeing it on the page, in as much as they might not be using the assistive technology themselves. So there can be a behind the scenes amount of content that is not obviously exposed to everyone, that often just does not get handled with accessibility. Now that's a kind of quite contentious point, because a lot of people think that things like hidden text can be quite useful. So to give an example of what I often prefer as a solution, you can think about something like a card. So the idea being you've got kind of a box container with some information in it. Now it's quite common for these to have, again, quite generic calls to action in them. Things like read more, find out more. Now what you could do is you could add some hidden text to that. You could add an ARIA label to that to essentially hard code some kind of meaning onto that call to action. Or what you could do, and this is what Hayden Pickering does in his inclusive components example, is instead take the name of that object, which in this case is a heading on the card. So this might, for example, be about the UXPA, and use something like ARIA described by to connect that to the read more button, so that then that read more button becomes read more about the UXPA, not by adding anything new to the page, not by adding anything behind the scenes, not with an ARIA label or anything else, but by leveraging the existing content that you have to knit it together more neatly for accessibility. And then when you come to localize that, it's localized. When you want to scale that to then build that into like 1,000 components over 1,000 different pages, that becomes a lot more maintainable than always having to go into that back end and tweak some hard-coded strings. Now, the kind of last section I was interested in talking a little bit about was exclusionary accessibility. So when we can approach accessibility in a way where we can actually push people away. So first and foremost, I absolutely evangelize that accessibility needs to be part of your user research. However, be very, very careful with treating it as glorified bug testers. So you do not want to be disabling users with your research. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you probably wouldn't be running a lab-based user testing with a website that you knew did not work with a mouse. You probably would not run a lab-based user testing session with an app that you know didn't respond to touch. Or potentially you didn't know. You didn't know whether or not it was going to respond to touch. So on the same kind of mindset as that, do you want to be running some kind of sessions with a website that you don't know has a keyboard trap right in the very first element? Do you want to run a user testing session with a page where when the user presses tab to try to navigate through the elements, they are instantly halted in their tracks? Partly because that isn't necessarily going to be the most fruitful session if you're spending an hour with a user and it's a blocker at the first hurdle. But also if you think about the user's perspective on that and the sensation of, I've been asked to come in to give my feedback on something, and my feedback is that I'm being blocked at the very, very first step. The other way to think about it is being vocal about your accessibility. Now that is very, very important. You do not want to keep your commitment to accessibility a secret, because for users, your accessibility is only as good as their awareness of your accessibility. If you do not tell people, hey, we are really committed to accessibility and we're doing a lot of work on it and we're really proud of it, then end users don't know about that. And a very common theme with accessibility is users getting the sense of, well, I have something that works for me and I'm going to stick to what works for me. I'm not interested in taking chances with something that might, again, stop me at the very first hurdle. So absolutely be vocal about how much you do for accessibility. However, do not make wild claims. Trust is paramount in accessibility. So in as much as if you say, we have made all of our websites entirely accessible, and then you push something live and it breaks that, and your promise to users is still 100% accessibility, then that's going to be something that leaves a very bad taste in the mouth of users. Similarly, avoid patting yourself on the back when talking about accessibility. This might seem a strange one. So a small story I have is I was at an event recently, and we were watching a video from a very kind of large multinational organization, put a video on screen saying their commitment to accessibility, and they were particularly interested in talking about it from the vision impaired point of view. And a colleague of mine who was sitting next to me leaned in and asked me, are they playing a video? And I said, yeah, they're playing a video. And my colleague said, what's the video about? Because it was a video all about their commitment to accessibility and empowering vision impaired users that didn't have audio descriptions, that could only be understood by visually perceiving what was in that video. And the takeaway from that, from my colleague's experience, was I held that company in quite high regard, but maybe I don't anymore. So whilst it's absolutely important to really care about accessibility, really champion it and be proud of what you do, always be willing to make it better and always be willing to listen to people who are potentially going to be saying, hey, here's something that we can potentially do to improve it. Now I'm going to cap off now kind of some of the topics I've been talking about. So what can you do? So hopefully I've convinced you of some of the kind of pitfalls that are out there. And now you're wondering, well, what can I do to try to avoid them? First and foremost, it is lean content and elegant components. So when in doubt, refer to things like the way ARIA practices that give loads of examples of how to build custom components in a way in which you are leveraging ARIA in a fantastically strong way. Ditto inclusive components, which is another kind of pattern library that really gives fantastic tutorials on, okay, you want to build something and you want to make sure it's accessible. You want to avoid adding accessibility for the sake of accessibility. So if you, for example, are thinking about alt attributes to add to images, or you're thinking about link text, or how to do heading structure, refer to the web accessibility tutorials. It will run you through things like page structure, images, etc., in a way that you know you are doing right by the users. Do not fall for accessibility snake oil. There will be organizations out there that are willing to say to you that they will fix your accessibility problems immediately and that you do not have to do the hard work. You do. There is hard work involved and there are no super quick fixes. And the solution to that is being honest about your issues and build a roadmap. If you are out there saying, hey, we know we have accessibility issues, and what we're doing is we're building a strong component library, we're working on our design system to make sure that accessibility is considered end-to-end in our process and everything we build, but we are sorry, but it's not going to be here until, for example, Q1 or Q2, do it. Do not try and solve those problems immediately, but be honest and transparent about what you are doing about those accessibility challenges. In terms of what else you can do is, again, I've talked about being transparent about how passionate you are. So be open and honest about your accessibility. And if you know about accessibility challenges you have, let users know. Be honest. So in as much as, for example, if you go onto GOV UK and look at their accessibility statement, they are very honest about the fact that there are certain accessibility challenges that they have. And if the government is expressing those challenges, saying, hey, we weren't able to get it perfect, here are some of the challenges and here's what we're going to do about them, then you can as well. And if you don't know, if you're feeling like you're not sure about how to know whether or not you have accessibility challenges, then again, the kind of resource I'd point you to is an article on how to do a basic accessibility check if you can't afford a detailed one. That runs through some of the basic stuff I've been talking about today. Simple things like tabbing through the page with your keyboard, trying out a screen reader, looking at the colors on the page, looking at the heading structure on the page and the images on the page, and doing something that at AbilityNet we'd kind of do on day one of maybe like a 10-day audit. So the kind of thing that anyone can do very quickly on anything they're building to make sure that there is a accessibility foundation present. And lastly, the thing I'm always going to recommend to people is have a dedicated mailbox for accessibility. So have an email address that people can just send in and say, hey, I came across this accessibility challenge. I wanted to let you know, and hopefully you can do something about it. The users of kind of the accessibility functionality are the people that can inform you about what they need and potentially what barriers you have in place. So make sure it is effortless as possible for them to let you know. Have things like accessibility champions, have people who aren't necessarily accessibility specialists, but have a hat that they can wear to make sure that someone is owning accessibility. People in testers, design, content, dev, to make sure that across the board you have people who will be in those meetings and say, okay, what about the accessibility perspective on this? Rather than it being something that you're necessarily outsourcing all the time, or is being approached as a kind of separate part of the sprint. And lastly, be humble. You will have accessibility challenges on a website. Chances are at some point you're going to fall into some of the pitfalls that I've mentioned today, and that's fine. Accessibility is all about imperfection and then working on it and trying to improve it. And so stay humble in what you're building and be open to improving it and recognizing some of the flaws that you can build on and make better. Awesome. And that is what I wanted to talk to you about today. So thank you very much for your time.
David, thank you so much for that talk. I'm sure all the attendees will be giving you a virtual or even real round of applause for that. And certainly as a practitioner, I related to most, if not all, of what you said. I've kind of dipped in and out of accessibility over the years, and I find it's a constantly moving target. And technology is always changing, and ARIA specifications are being developed all the time. So it's certainly, accessibility is a challenge, but that's one of the good things about it, right? That's why we do it. I'd like to open up the for questions. So we have the Q&A function and also the chat function. So I think if you use the Q&A or raise your hand, if you have a question, then you can either speak, or if you want to use the chat function, we'll keep an eye on that for any questions. Aha, so I see a hand up. I'm hoping, yeah, okay, so I've got two. So I'm going to go to Charlene first. So in a moment, I'm going to unmute you and you'll be able to speak.
Two questions I have. One is when you showed that, the website where they give you boards for using your, making sure your website is accessible. In that case, is the reason you're getting those big red hovers around multiple links is because there's already nicely accessibly code behind, and is it overlapping and colliding with each other, and that's the reason it's happening? Or is it the way their bot was designed? Like, is it possible that when you're using two things it goes like crazy like that?
Potentially, that's a really interesting point, and one thing that I had to hold myself back from running through multiple examples of these plugins not working fantastically well. The kind of core message to drive is when I was kind of showing off like the BBC website, for example, is that there was nothing there, like that there was no kind of special plugin, there was no special tool. What I was using is very much kind of standard tools, so using a keyboard, for example, and the kind of CSS that they've written in the background. And that's stuff that you can't turn off. Like you can't, for example, disable basic browser behavior. And if you try to do that, you're potentially going into very dangerous territory. So you're really on the right track where it's like, okay, well, hang on, it seems to work without that tool. And when we add that tool onto it, it starts to break. And yes, potentially part of that problem is the fact you're trying to build on something that kind of potentially works quite well with something that doesn't work quite well. And suddenly you've got a very strange combination, as opposed to just relying on not needing that tool in the first place.
That sounds good. Brilliant. The other question is, I don't want, if I sound really stupid, do you need to be very good with your codes and you need to understand how CSS exactly works? Do you have to be very technically to actually understand these, or, you know, to somehow integrate accessibility to your website. Let's say I'm a UX designer, I can inspect element, I can understand basics of CSS and HTML, but I'm not really a core, and I don't see myself going anywhere close to actually sitting down and, you know, writing my codes. So do you need to have a deeper knowledge, or how much, you know, how much crazy do you have to go when you're learning about accessibility, or maybe, you know, when you're trying to build something on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. In terms, the thing kind of that I would stress is that the way to make something as accessible as possible, one option with that is to build it as close to the standard specification as possible. So something that is just built really against the vanilla HTML spec. You're not using any really complicated JavaScript libraries, for example. You're not building really complex components. Chances are, and there are some little warts here and there, but chances are that has a very solid foundation of accessibility. So accessibility isn't about developing something and then trying to add lots of accessibility onto it with lots of complicated code. To be honest, a lot of the time it's building things that are as simple as possible and robust as possible, and the kind of minimal amount of accessibility add-on you need should be very light. It's like it should be a very, very light touch that you add on.
Okay.
Then it's generally, it's quite easy to learn.
Got it. Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Sorry?
I'm going to go to Lena now. Lena, you should be able to ask a question now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, well, brilliant. Okay. I still don't get when you refer to the snake oil on companies, what are they doing that is underhand and not upfront?
So they are claiming that without you needing to change your code at all, that you can implement a plugin that will wave a magic wand and will just make your stuff accessible.
Oh, okay.
Now, the core underlying problem with that is that, as we kind of talked about with the last question, is that accessibility is all about what's under the hood of your website, all about what's under the hood of your app. No amount of kind of plastering on top of that with some kind of extra plugin or app can ultimately change what potentially is a problem at source. Similarly, the claim, and this is something that one of the reasons I will talk about as being snake oil and why I am comfortable doing it, is that they very much stress that the point of their tools is to keep you away from lawsuits, that they will make you, for example, ADA compliant, or in the UK, for example, public sector organizations who are now under the remit of the public sector accessibility guidelines, that essentially legally requires conformance to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Their promise is that if you use their tool, that you are meeting that law, and that simply isn't true. Not true at all.
And one final question. I think you said something along the lines that accessibility is, I forgot the word. It's not like an exact science.
Yes.
So if I go to an accessibility company, they can say your website is AA. I can go to another one, they'll say it's AAA. Is that how it works?
Yes and no. So one of the things that we will do as part of accessibility, so you can think of this as being part of the accessibility kind of keychain, is things like web content accessibility audits. There's more to it. There's things like design reviews you can do. There's kind of automated tests you can do. There's things like user research you can do. But part of it is this kind of idea of an audit where you get the web content accessibility guidelines, a standard, and apply it. Now, in terms of variability that you'll get, you will get variability, but there'll be low priority variability. So there'll be things where we'll say, oh, in our experience, users actually prefer it slightly this way. In our interpretation of the standard, we actually think the standard is saying something like this. But that's going to more so be the kind of really kind of quite subjective areas in the first place, e.g. images, alt text. Is that alt text any good? In terms of, can I control it with a keyboard? Can I control it with the standard keys that I should expect to be using? Does it work efficiently with a screen reader? Those are very kind of core things that you should get a very consistent message, regardless of what kind of partners you choose to work with.
Brilliant, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I can see there are some other questions and also some in the chat. I think what we do though is we'll move on to our next speakers and then perhaps the panelists and myself will respond to some of the questions, because I think, for example, the question around how do you go about addressing accessibility as an organisation might well be answered in part by our next talk. So I'm very pleased to introduce Gareth and Charlie from the BBC. I always think, when I think of accessibility, I think of the BBC, and I always think, okay, if I need to find a good example, how do the BBC do it? And I'm always impressed by how they do it. And so what we're going to do now is hear from Charlie and Gareth about how they go about addressing accessibility. So guys, I will hand over to you. You should be able to share your screen.
Hi, can you hear us?
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Right.
This is going to be interesting, isn't it?
I know, right?
We're not going to be able to see each other, and we're going to have a go at trying to co-present. This should be fun.
Let's have a little go.
Hey, lovely. Can you run that full? That's it. Full screen. Strange. It's sort of slightly over to the left, but it seems to be working enough. So I'm Gareth. Obviously, I'm Gareth Ford-Williams. I could be Charlie Turrell.
Let's swap.
All right, I'm Charlie Turrell.
There you go. Yeah, and I'm Gareth Ford-Williams.
Identity fluid. So we are, obviously two members of the accessibility team at the BBC. I set the team up 15 years ago because there was no accessibility team in digital at a time when I think there were 13 divisions in the BBC all running their own teams, and there was no sort of set of standards or anything that was being complied to at the time. So it's I can give you a little bit. I had a couple of years away at UView, but for most of the time I've been involved in it. And Charlie is the newest member of the team, who's joined us to manage the Champions Network, which is what I'm gonna finally get around to talking about. So can't see them all. I don't know if is it just my screen, or is it seems to be sort of off to the side. So we've got 7 members of the team, and which seems incredibly small for an organisation and a state, a digital state as large as the BBC. Screen looks fine to me. Someone just said fabulous. So it's just me.
It's always just you.
It's always just me. So yeah, 7 members, and we do a mixture of stuff. One of the things that I do try not to do, and we haven't done for many years, is audit. Really don't believe in auditing. I used to do a lot of auditing. In the early days, it seemed to be most of my life was auditing. But I think it's one of these. We changed our philosophy several years ago, probably roughly about 10 years ago, and just said, look, if we just don't plan to break it in the first place, then we don't need to audit it. So let's change all of the focus and make accessibility a front-loaded activity. And it kind of makes. I mean, we still need to audit every now and again. You audit to learn. You might do things like one of the ones we did many years ago was to just audit labeling conventions and to make sure that we're doing things correctly across the estate and we're not calling things multiple things, and improving usability through that technique, but not as a sign-off function. It's interesting, a lot of stuff that David said, we're not going to kind of duplicate what he's covered, but I totally agree with pretty much everything that David said. It's one of those things to always remember with HTML. This is a quote from a chap called Ian Pouncey from Tetralogical, who's also ex-BBC, but he always says HTML is a screen reader's UX. When you're designing, and you are designing your semantic structure and your labeling and everything around it, you'll think it's a UX function. That's not a technical function when it comes down to it. That's a UX function. And really, what we think about it is that inaccessibility is caused by bad design and technical decisions. So when you start at the beginning of a project and you've not built anything or designed anything or agreed anything, then everyone can access it equally. And the more decisions you make, the more people you filter out. Sometimes we even honestly sit down and just say, actually, who are we agreeing to not support here? Are we going to support feature phones? Was this for, people who are using Mosaic as a browser? That shows my age. And they're real decisions. You turn around and just say, no, this is our strategy around browser support. And accessibility is very much like that. You've got to think about, the breadth of the audience that you're supporting. Do you want to pop to the next one? So I'm going to try and drop a couple of things in here. Oh, something that this this is having an ADHD brain is now totally obsessing with that snake oil in my head. From David bringing this up, it's a pet subject of mine. Totally get it. And one thing that we come across is in accessibility is more snake oil than just David's pointed out. You know, one of my favorite areas of snake oil is accessible fonts. And there's quite a few of them out there that claim to be accessible and have absolutely no research behind them, just a bunch of anecdotes, which is not data. You know, we do stuff. I'm just going to pop a link in. So if you're ever interested in font accessibility, we've put this paper up today for download. But that's an area, you know, you're going to come across it as UX designers all the time. So one of the things we try and get past a lot of this snake oil is we do have guidelines, we have our own. So we do use WCAG sort of in a sort of second-hand kind of way, is that we take WCAG and we contextualize it. We think about the things that we want to build, and then we use that to build our own guidance. So GEL is one of the is our design system. Some of you may be aware of that. So GEL, I've just popped it down, another link in the chat. So you can go and have a look at that. All of that is taken from, you know, the patterns that we see as common and techniques and approaches that we have. And we try and, you know, we've built accessible things, we capture it and then share the goodness. Do you want to do the next slide, Charlie? We also have our own product accessibility guidelines. Now, these are the things where we take existing international guidelines, we recontextualize it, reimagine it, make it easier. Guidelines, one of the biggest problems with guidelines is they're unusable. And it's a massive issue for us because it takes up an enormous amount of resource that every time you build something, you've got to read all the guidelines to work out which ones are relevant. And it hoovers up so much energy. And so we try to then make it a lot easier. And then we kind of redesigned them ourselves and improved it. And so again, I'll stick you a link up to that. And then we've recently taken it a step further. Do you want to put the next slide up, Charlie? And then we've taken it a little bit further. So then we took the guidelines and we took the GEL patterns. And instead of, initially in the organization, they thought about building a component library. But as an organization, we have multiple products and they all do different things in different ways for very good reasons. And they have their own code repositories and their own code libraries. So we ended up building, you know, in the middle of developing a documentation-driven development approach to accessibility. So instead, you know, as a developer, you want to know how to build a promo, we then, you know, there's a link there, go and have a look at it. And there's everything you need to know about accessibility, about promos that then sit to being GEL compliant. And they're technology agnostic, so you can build it out of whatever third-party library you're doing, but it tells you about the code behaviors and the various bits and pieces. So do you want to do the next one? So the thing is, we build all of these things, we develop a lot of bits and pieces and tools, and we have you know, a lot of training that we try and do ourselves and support the organization. But it's a big organization, so integration at scale with a huge media organization with things like iPlayer and Sport and News and Children's and Education and all the rest of it becomes a massive problem. And that's where the champions came in. The champions, do you want to next slide, Charlie? So there are a few of the champions. There's actually roughly, and I'm hoping Emma or Charlie will stick up the exact number because I've forgotten it. Is it 210 roughly?
I think it's 210, yeah. Emma will know more.
Emma will know the exact number. I will depend on it.
Yeah.
She'll put it in the chat because I know she's in the audience. I'm pretty sure she's in the audience. But so we have this network that's constantly growing and changing. And obviously, you know, there's turnover of staff and people move on to new positions and change. But we've got these 210 champions. They're the voice of accessibility. They have varying degrees of knowledge. Some of them are incredibly knowledgeable in a very specific way. So they may be a business analyst or a QA engineer or a designer or a developer or product manager or someone from editorial. They're all sorts of people, but they care about it and they want to integrate it into their work. And they also become the voice of accessibility in all the sprints. And they're amazing. And some of them are quite extraordinary people. And this group has grown up over the years. It's going to be 10 years old next year. It's had 5 managers over that period of time. We did have a sort of accessibility champions network in the past for 2 years, which was like the prototype one, but it kind of came back in when I returned from UView. We ended up setting this network up again, when one chap called Al Duggan, who was a principal developer, who ended up setting up the accessibility team for GDS, phenomenally brilliant guy who was part of the original group, came and said, I want mentoring from Henny, who was on our team at the time. And he kind of became the first accessibility champion. She and him worked incredibly closely on the 2012 Olympics, which he was principal dev on. And then he trained his team, was the voice of it. And then we thought, how many Als are there out there? And yeah, 210. 206, sorry, a dozen waiting to onboard. I knew it was I knew it was an exact number. Thank you very much, Emma. So, but it's an interesting thing. So we've come to a point now where we've gone through 4 people of Henny, Ian, Jamie, plus Lion, and Emma, who are all accessibility specialists. And we've then decided to take a change of tack. And Charlie has joined the team, and Charlie's background is in kind of community management and network management, and she's dealt with all sorts of stuff around organizational stuff and learning. And we just thought, hang on a minute, these are all qualities you need for an organization like this. And so switching to a more change management perspective seemed to be the right thing to do. So Charlie, over to you.
Oh, yes. So I'm Charlie. Thanks for the introduction, Gareth. And I've recently joined the team to do some change management. I've always been quite passionate about the culture, the diversity and the inclusion. So taking over the Champions Network has really provided me with a great outlook to really develop these areas. The network has been grown and supported by the accessibility team with an aim to develop the members' skills and to ensure accessibility has a voice. However, there is something missing, and it is that strong culture. As Gareth was saying, we've got over 206 accessibility champions, and it is really inspiring to see people passionate about embedding accessibility into their work. The champions take part in the training sessions and attend lots of different sessions that we run by our team, and we start interesting conversations from that. But where do you go from here? How do we develop a strong culture in the network? How can we as a small team really nurture that interest? How can we develop the champions to start to work together and strengthen their skills? So I joined the team not because of my accessibility knowledge, because there's a lot of room to grow in that area, and it's been really fascinating to look at all the GAAD talks that have been going on today, but because I like to develop my understanding of people and really tapping into their reasons for joining the network in the first place. So the members come to us, and if we can understand the reasons why, we can really motivate them in the right way. So I'm not here to change what the network does. I'm here to evolve and make sure we can push it into the next stage of its development. So we currently have one set model. We try and fit that into multiple cultures in our organisation. So the culture in our sport team is vastly different to the one in our CBeebies team, even down to the pace, the way of working and the way that they think about their audiences. We need to make the network fit that individual culture of each team. And that is a bit of a challenge. We also need the network and the training to work for the individual. And in the accessibility team, we've got a second change manager, Becky Nancaro, who focuses on the skills development and the training. We don't all learn in the same way, and we don't all learn at the same pace. So the one shoe model doesn't fit all, basically. Everyone in the accessibility team feeds into this, and we also draw from established and emergent skills that come from the network. It's also about how we keep people motivated and excited about embedding accessibility into their product, into the way that they think about design just from the offset. We know that not everyone jumps at the opportunity to do this, and maybe that could be a confidence issue, or sometimes simply because it's brand new. So in BBC News and Sport and iPlayer, the champions have started to create these subgroups and guilds, and we even have accessibility leads as roles that have appeared. Two of the pioneers of this network are Catherine, who's become the first accessibility lead in BBC News, and Sophie in BBC Sport, who's currently working in WebGo. And we try and keep the teams cross-pollinating ideas through our Slack channels and through our events. And many of the champions are coming up with the ideas and approaches that have been adopted by other teams. So it isn't universal, it's not uniform, and in this way the network can teach us what it does and how it doesn't work, and also where difference is needed. So the accessibility team are the enablers of the network, and it's our responsibility to make sure that they have the resources that they need, the visible support when they need it. And what's key is to have an open mind when we're asked questions. So we don't push, we encourage, and we try and instill that confidence and behave as equals, and see the accessibility champions as leads in our peer group. Accessibility isn't a dark art, and it doesn't belong to anyone because it has to be in everything. And the responsibility and the adventure is shared between us. So each Champions Network Manager has enabled this and has added value. And changing managers has really enabled the network to evolve, because we've all got different styles and the needs of the network does change. We've had external changes, we've had culture changes, we've had staff change, and our needs change. And as an organisation at the minute, the BBC is really undergoing quite a significant change. There are even changes happening now in just the way that we all work and our environment. And we have to flex and create different ways of doing things. And I think this is where my challenge will be, not to lose any of the intrinsic value while supporting the network through uncertainty and a bit of upheaval. So by focusing more on the culture as an approach, I think we intend to strengthen the community and to encourage and to create this positive reinforcement and really drive openness. We want the members of the network to feel supported and to really have pride and ownership in their work. So the network has succeeded so far, and there are two measures of this. So our champions have made films about their work and they talk about it at conferences, they build tools in their own time, and they even leave the BBC to become accessibility professionals full time and take the BBC practices with them. So here we've got a tablet which was developed by a personal, as a personal project by Peter Gold, a senior tester and an accessibility champion. And the personal project is now starting to be adopted as great design and great development and as a testing tool. So over the last few years, various organisations have started developing their own champions networks. So you might have heard of them and you might even be a part of them. But they're not directly copying the BBC's model, which is great. It means that they're finding a model that's driven by their organisational culture and by their need and by their ethos. And they're flexible in meeting the needs of the network members as well. And I think, like David said before, there's no perfect way, and we're trying to work it out, and we're 5 managers in, there's real potential here that we're trying to reach. And it's really, really okay to fail. It's okay to try again. New people come along, we see it differently. It's those differences between us that will drive real change. And we know the job is never done. We need to continue to sustain it. We need to continue to develop it. We need to continue to adapt it. And when the environment we create nurtures people to just have a go, when the champions are teaching each other and asking questions, we see the projects becoming more accessible naturally. We're equal partners in accessibility, and together we can actually shape the way accessibility looks in the future of the BBC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Gareth, for that great talk. Once again, we'll open up to questions, but I have one for you both, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Accessibility is a tough one because lots of people have lots of different opinions on what is right or wrong. So how do you come to a consensus when you have such a large team about what is the standard way that you're going to approach something?
Oh, we talked about this earlier, weren't we, Gareth? I think you had some great ideas.
Well, it's one of those, you've got to start about your whole approach to this is really, you know, if so many organizations talk about accessibility, actually, weirdly enough, or they talk about everybody, or they talk about community, and they talk about accessibility in loads of different ways, actually within their strategy documents. I mean, it was always quite amusing to me that Domino's Pizzas actually talks about it being for all the family and for everyone and for community and all the rest of it, whilst they were being sued in the High Court in America for being inaccessible. And he's out there going, there's a massive disconnect here between your strategy and what you're saying about your organization and what you're actually delivering. And so, you know, the BBC always says the BBC is for everyone, and it can't be for everyone and not them over there. You know, you've got to have that holistic approach. And so you think about it in various different ways. I always, you know, there's a kind of a lot of changes in the way that accessibility as a subject is being viewed now, because accessibility, you can look at it as an impairment thing. You can turn around and say, you know, and I'd advise everyone to look at the social model of disability, because, you know, people have impairments, and depending on design decisions is how we impair people. So if we decided with New Broadcasting House not to put it on the street level and make sure it was wheelchair accessible, that decision by us, you know, disables some people from entering the building. So it's those kind of things approach. So you've got to think about it as environmental and situational as well as medical. And, you know, there's another great, you know, if you're thinking about environmental or situational accessibility, is perfect one for UX.
All week he's had technical issues. Can you hear us?
Gareth, we have lost you.
No, I'm back again.
Oh, there we go.
It's because I've had to tether to my phone because my home network is an absolute pig, but and it wasn't reliable, and someone just tried to phone me up. So so what I was going to say, yes, so situational and environmental accessibility, perfect example for UX is color contrast. So the reason that you do it is about vision impairment. It's really, really important. But the reason you do it on mobile isn't just is a broader idea of vision impairment, is because the one thing that people do to save their battery life is to turn the brightness of their screen down, and then they're outside in really bright ambient light. And so therefore, if you're not doing a high contrast interface, those people, which is the majority of pretty much everyone who've got this situational and environmental accessibility problem, can't access your website or your app. You know, it just makes common sense. And you find that most accessibility, if not all accessibility, has this kind of universal side of it.
I think that's a really good point, and somebody in the comments mentioned the role of empathy in accessibility, and I think trying to relate it to yourself is really important. I think I attended a couple of sessions over the last couple of days, and it wasn't just about screen readers, it's also and various other barriers that we can create in design. It's also how we can have barriers, either temporary or permanent. Or so I think, for example, one of the barriers was, for me, I'm only 5'2" and I can't reach a really high shelf, so for me that is a barrier. And so it's reminding people that it's not just people that you're designing for in the accessibility community. There's barriers everywhere, and that does create that empathy and in a way to be able to put people in other people's shoes.
Bruno Mag said something really well. If you've ever come across Bruno, he worked with us on BBC Reith. Dalton Mag is his agency, and he always says he says accessibility has three lenses to it. It says functional, technical, and emotional. And with the functional and technical, it's always fascinating because that's basically multimodality, is what he talks about with that. You know, functional, it's the way that, you know, if you're going to design something, you're designing an app, you've got to make sure it works with a touch screen. You've got to make sure it works with, you know, pointing devices. If it's, you know, you've got to make sure everything works with the keyboard. There's multimodalities in everything, or in consumption or navigation. So if you can't hear it, you can see it or you can feel it. Multimodality is what accessibility has been from day one. So there's lots of different ways you can kind of find it. You find a kind of language that fits with your organization strategically, and then an approach, and then you start building on that.
I think I saw a question from Daffyd about the tips for accessibility at scale, and I think that's really where the Champions Network comes in and does some incredible work. I mean, we are a small team, and to have that reach over a massive business can be really difficult. And whereas if you're creating this desire to be a champion and to learn and to develop, that can spread across a business in a really positive way. And so that's when you see these little groups that are popping up, and all of a sudden everybody in that one product is working at a really high level regarding accessibility, because the passion was there and one person started it and gone, actually, you know, I've been in this training because I'm part of this network. And everybody goes, oh, right, well, I didn't realize, should we do that as a group, and should we all get involved? And then that tends to spread as a really positive thing. And so the accessibility scale, that is one of the key ways that I found it really works for our team.
Yeah, it's not a dark art. It's not for
No.
those people over there doing magic stuff in the corner.
No.
You know, we all have a little part
We're
to play
open.
in. Yeah, I think we've got quite a few. We've got some other
We'll go
raised
on.
hands and stuff.
Lena, I think you were first. Lena, if you have a question.
Yes, thank you. So the question is, why did you feel the need to create your own guidelines, and is it public?
It is public. I put the link up in the chat a little bit earlier. So if you pop back up. Now, we did that, was the first thing that we did. So when I set the team up, we were just basically part of initially, I set up a little team within a team that was building this new thing for the BBC that no one knew what it was called or what kind of quite worked out the functionality of it yet. And it eventually became called iPlayer. But it was like 2 years. I was sort of part of that first team. And we had this little team, and we decided in there to try and work out what it is that we needed to do to make things accessible, because no one knew what they should be doing and how they were following it and how it all worked or mapped together. So we took a lot of stuff. There were holes in WCAG in those days. There were many holes, and there still are bits that are ambiguous, and there's some subjective stuff in there. So what we've done is we've taken all of those bits and pieces, and then we've added our own objectivity to it, and we've contextualized it in the one thing with WCAG is trying to be all things to all people, and it does an incredibly good job of trying to be all things to all people. But in some places, it doesn't either go far enough, or there is other bits and pieces that are missing or slightly wrong in those contexts. And so we've ended up building our own guidelines. It was also quite political, because we had these 13 different teams. And literally I got a group together, which was the first accessibility group. Emma, who's on the chat as well, who was one of the champions managers, was part of that original group. And, you know, literally we met over a series of weeks and just all decided first off that the first decision we made was that we were going to have one heading level 1 on every page. And this was 2006. We had one heading level 1 on every page, and we decided the function of that heading level 1. And that was the main sort of purpose of the page. So if it was a news page, it would be the article headline. And so we don't have it as the first heading on the page, because then all our heading level 1s would be in the global navigation, and they'd all be the same, which would be pointless. So you put the heading level 1 as, you know, what is the page about? So it's always that main piece of information. And then we just slowly built and said, okay, as we agree in that, we captured it. And they're very similar in a lot of places, and we also directly draw in some places from WCAG, but there's a lot of our own stuff in there. We beat WCAG to it on the mobile guidelines by about 2 years at least, and things, because we needed mobile guidelines because of the 2012 Olympics, and there were no accessibility guidelines for mobile, so we created our own. And we're doing the same now. We're building data sets for VR around accessibility. And Emma, again, who's on the chat, is now, one of her things is to look at voice as a platform and around guidance on there. And so, you know, you build these things and they become tools and resources for your organization.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
That's all right.
Danielle, you also have your hand up. I'm going to unmute you so you can talk.
Hi. I'm just wondering, because I'm a content designer currently working specifically on accessibility and accessible content, and I just wondered if that is something that you covered within your guidelines, and if you have content designers on your accessibility team who deal specifically in accessible content.
What kind of content is it? Because that's a very broad.
So I work on government services.
So is this like infographics, AV content?
Usually sort of guidance and form content.
So that's, well, the thing is with content, it sits in various different places. So the BBC has editorial guidelines. So we don't try and duplicate guidelines where there are guidelines. So, you know, there are guidelines for designers, and there are technical guidelines, and there are guidelines for editorial people. And we try and work across all of the different guidance to make sure the right things sit in the right place. But the thing is, there's also sometimes there's duplication because you need to implement the editorial. And so we need, you know, sometimes we sit in various different places, and, you know, games comes under another group. And David's actually worked, strangely enough, with us, and so we know David very well, so we try and fit these things in various different places so the right people have the right guidance. So you'll find a lot of the type of things like forms development, that would sit in GEL, but the thing is, if you're working in GDS, you are so far ahead of us on forms accessibility because we don't really have very many forms. We've got the login, search field, and there are probably about 3 other instances of a form on the entire site, probably complaints being one of them, and you really want to get that right. Don't make your complaints form inaccessible. If someone's on there, they're already really pissed off. You don't want to annoy them anymore. So, you know, we actually draw a lot from GDS on that because there's some absolutely superb guidance that you've got that W3C don't have. So you find there's resources all out there, and you find that different organizations build these resources based on their needs.
Maeva, I hope I've got the pronunciation correctly.
Oh, yes. Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. So I know you were talking about modalities, like multimodalities. I was actually going to ask about multisensory interactions and how you could apply that to make a product more accessible, like maybe possibly using voice design or gestural design.
What kind of products are we talking about? Give us a context.
Just like just a general app or website. In terms of like working with people with disabilities, because of course people have different limitations, they have different disabilities. So using multisensory interactions in terms of navigation to help them to make, you know, the product more accessible, more usable.
Yeah, we've done this before. We've done all sorts of bits and pieces. So we've had a lot of games that, I mean, we have a slightly different ethos when it comes to games. So games, instead of building we used to build games, and we used to build accessible games. And I think they're probably the best example I can look at it. And we realized that was massively wrong. There was a what's the right word there now? Oh, okay. It was. This is being dyslexic. I've got a word there, and it's disappeared. But you know, it was wrong from a societal kind of perspective, because what we were doing by creating accessible games and games is we were actually separating children, because children all play the same game and then they all talk about the game. And if you're separating children out, they can't be part of the conversation of their peers, because you're excluding them by building an accessible game. And so we try and make the most inclusive games we possibly can. And this is our aim. And we're slowly chipping away that is making sure that we have games that all the children can join in with all of the fun on Danger Mouse or whatever. And so even when it came down to switch modes and supporting switch functionality on mobile devices, you know, we've had them where you can shout at the thing, it becomes a switch. So every time you make a noise, we've had games that do this. You just make a noise at the mobile device and it treats it as a switch input. And so you can then start using, you know, there's all sorts of different ways then, you know, think about, this is about multimodalities. How many affordances does the device that you're building for allow, and what are the needs of the users? And you best match it up as possible. It's an incredibly vague way of answering your question, but I hope that.
Integrating gamification is a good way to use like a multimodalities.
Well, we do it in that context, but it's a damn good question. I mean, it's an area where, you know, again, this is the great thing about accessibility. There's so many different areas where you can add all sorts of, you can find research on that. It's not an area we've done a huge amount on, but we try and take advantage of every form of input on a device and every form of control device, because if you're supporting accessibility predominantly from a platform level perspective, you find that, you know, Apple and Google and Microsoft are actually doing most of the work for you. You just need to tap into it. You know, the stuff is already in there, and you just need to think of interesting ways. Then you add users in at one end, and you add your design and product ideas and stuff at the other end, and the whole thing works holistically. But it's not, I think that, you know, as David said, it's not an exact art on this stuff, and it is all about context and the users that you're aiming at. That's a very vague answer. I'm really sorry.
Yeah,
I think someone's kettle's gone off.
There are some questions in the Q&A. A good one from Heather. How do you differentiate between people interested in accessibility or working on accessibility and actual accessibility champions, or do you differentiate between them?
Charlie?
Yeah, I think the champions get an awful lot of support when it comes down to training, events and that kind of thing. But I think if you're working on accessibility and you're interested in accessibility, come along, join in and be a champion. It's kind of like we almost want there to be no difference, really. I think what I've noticed recently regarding the champions as well is it's not all about the knowledge that you have and therefore you want to be a champion because you're already great at accessibility or you work in depth on it. We've had a few people recently who just want to champion accessibility. They want to be the one in the room to ask the question. They might not know the answer, but they want to make sure that other people are thinking about it. And so for me, I think if you are working on that kind of area, then we want them to come in and join to be a part of what we're doing. And then we get updates for things. We have a Slack channel where we can all have these discussions about the best practice and the best way of doing something. So it's just being a champion means you have access to all these tools and these trainings. So we almost want everyone to be a part of it. And then at least we can all be thinking in the same way.
Yeah, not everyone wants to get involved. Some people will dip in and dip out, and that's perfectly fine. Yeah. We try not to be exclusive around that, and we try and do things like we train all the designers. So, you know, we've got a UX team of over 200 people, and we try and train everybody equally within UX. I mean, there's a kind of, that makes sense to do that anyway, because if you break it in UX, you usually can't fix it in the tech. You know, it's really hard, and then that wastes a huge amount of money further down the line. But yeah, it's as Charlie said, it's not an exclusive differentiation. No. And if you want to wear the badge, that's fine. Come and join, and we'll try and build that community around that title.
I think it's just having the right kind of attitude as well. I think that's one of the things about the champions. We've got the right attitude is let's ask questions. There's no silly questions. Let's at least have a look at an alternative. Let's not create additional barriers. So I think with the champions network, it's really helpful to have those people in those rooms asking those questions. But you know, if you don't want to do it all the time, if you're not, you know, you don't want to do tons and tons of training, that's also fine. But the network is there for you to be a part of, to dip in and out if you do want to.
I'm aware we're coming up to 8 o'clock, and obviously 8 o'clock there is the applause for the essential workers. Does anyone have a final question to ask verbally, or if not, perhaps we can respond to some of the questions in the Q&A answer after the formal proceedings? Great stuff. So what I'd like to do is thank all of our speakers, all three of them, for giving some great talks and lots of useful things we can take away and use in our accessibility journey. I'd like to thank you all for attending. Please do give us a shout out on Twitter at UXPA UK if you've enjoyed the event. Hopefully we'll see you same time next year or same time next month. I will leave the meeting open, like I say, so we can pick up the questions that are open in the Q&A panel, but I will close the formal proceedings there, and thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you.